The morning air arrives like a sharpened blade, cutting through the thin fabric of the tent, and Elias feels the heavy weight of their Alaskan winter. He watches the pale vapor of his own breath, rising in rhythmic and ghostly spirals, while the ancient trees stand as silent witnesses to his fragile life. The frost has mapped intricate and crystalline patterns across the surface of his rusted stove, indicating that the fire died long before the midnight hour. His fingers move with a slow and calculated caution, reaching for the stiff wool of his coat, as the silence of the tundra presses against his ears. Every fiber of the heavy garment feels like lead, dragging against his aching and tired shoulders, while the cold deepens its grip on his very marrow. The metal butts are small and treacherous discs of ice, burning his cracked and bleeding skin, as he forces them through the stubborn and frozen buttholes. He focuses on the tactile sensation of the rough thread, looping through the dark and weathered fabric, until the task becomes a ritual of pure survival. Outside the world is a vast and monochromatic canvas, stretching toward a horizon of jagged peaks, where no mercy is offered to the weak or small. The leather of his boots has hardened into stone, requiring a forceful and steady hand to soften, while the smell of old grease fills the cramped space. He pulls the laces with a sudden and sharp intensity, feeling the tension in his rigid and swollen joints, as the wind begins to moan through the trees. There is no room for a single wasted movement in this kingdom of absolute and terrifying white, because nature watches for any sign of human fading or fear. The shadow of a mountain falls across the valley, like the hand of a cold and indifferent god, reminding the man of his own fleeting and mortal existence. He remembers the distant heat of a summer city, where people spoke in loud and careless voices, but that memory feels like a dream from another life. Now the only reality is the bite of the air, and the steady thrum of his own cautious heart, beating against the immense and crushing weight of the void. The silence is not merely a lack of any sound, but a physical and heavy presence in the room, demanding a tribute of blood and sweat from the living. He stands up and feels the floorboards groan aloud, under the weight of his weary and heavy frame, while the darkness retreats from the coming of the gray dawn. Toivo kungzin LEVSNGT Quang Nai. Toidakwa me mak kai tuan, th vic dung eli sao meph, and h maquern emt arn nang elk sia min ko thx li kh lung eln han en hu trong emt eln dopen ji. Min la du mbo dung ke lut da di ra. Elias reaches for the heavy handle of the iron axe, feeling the coarse and splintered grain of their ash wood against the raw skin of his palms. The metal head of the tool is a dull and frozen slate, carrying the scent of dried pine and ancient rust, while the morning light begins to bleed. He lifts the weight above his broad and weary shoulders, sensing the tension in his tight and frozen muscles as the air catches in his burning throat. The blade descends with a sudden and brutal velocity, biting into the heart of a cedar log and releasing a sharp and aromatic spray of wood. He watches the clean white wood split into two halves, falling away with a hollow and rhythmic thud, while the mountain echoes the violence of his labor. Every swing is a calculated and desperate conversation with death, demanding a sacrifice of calories and sweat, in a world where heat is the only currency. He feels the vibration travel through the wooden shaft, rattling the bones of his stiff and aching wrists, as the cold air rushes into the new wound. The pile of logs grows slowly beside the weathered cabin wall, representing a few more hours of precious and flickering life against the vast and encroaching shadows. His breath comes in heavy and jagged plumes of white, obscuring the sight of the jagged and distant peaks, while the silence of Alaska remains completely unbroken. The rhythm of the work becomes a hypnotic and dark prayer, stripping away the layers of his civilized and forgot self until only the animal core remains. He ignores the sharp and stinging bite of the wind, focusing only on the geometry of the grain and the cold steel of the biting and heavy axe. The sun remains a distant and mocking eye of silver, watching the small man struggle against the immense and frozen eternity of the great and white north. He carries the fresh timber into the cramped and dim cabin, feeling the sudden and heavy transition of the air as the door groans on its hinges. The stove is a cold and empty iron belly, waiting for the offering of wood and fire, while the frost creeps along the edges of the floorboards. He kneels on the hard and dusty wooden planks, striking a single match with a steady and practiced hand, as the tiny flame flickers in the gloom. The first curl of smoke is a delicate and gray ghost, rising through the dark and narrow chimney, while the smell of burning sap fills the room. He watches the fire consume the small and dry shavings, turning the darkness into a warm and amber sanctuary, as the metal begins to pop and groan. The heat radiates outward in slow and invisible waves, touching the surface of his frozen and numb face, while the ice on the window begins to weep. He places the larger logs into the glowing and hungry maw, hearing the roar of the air through the vents and feeling the first pulse of hope. The cabin becomes a fortress of flickering and fragile light, standing against the immense and terrifying void of the wild, where the gods of winter sleep. He listens to the wind scratching at the thick log walls, like a beast with long and invisible claws, demanding entry into his small and warm world. The interior of the house is filled with shadows, dancing across the rows of rusted and old cans, while the kettle begins to hiss on the stove. Every sound is magnified in this cathedral of absolute and lonely silence, from the crackle of the wood to the steady and slow thrum of blood. He sits in the battered and creaking wooden chair, feeling the exhaustion settle into his very marrow, as the warmth begins to soften his hard and tired soul. Through the small and blurred glass of the window, he sees a lone wolf standing on the ridge, watching the cabin with yellow and ancient eyes. The predator is a shadow of gray and silver fur, blending into the monotony of the shifting and frozen snow, while the wind carries its silent scent. Elias feels the gaze of the wild upon his skin, acknowledging the presence of a witness to his struggle, in this land where no one is truly alone. The animal does not move or make a single sound, acting as a sentinel of the cold and bitter void, while the man holds his heavy and warm mug. He thinks of the people he left in the world below, wondering if they still walk the bright and noisy streets, while he fades into the white and vast silence. The memory of their faces is a blurred and fading photograph, losing its detail in the blinding and constant glare of their eternal and frozen Alaskan light. He accepts the solitude as a heavy and necessary garment, protecting his mind from the madness of the empty sky and the cruelty of their indifferent stars. The wolf turns away and vanishes into the thick timber, leaving only a trail of deep and lonely prints in the fresh and powdery skin of the earth. He prepares his simple and meager meal of dried meat, tasting the salt and the smoke on his tongue, as the day begins to die in the west. The sky turns a deep and bruised shade of violet, reflecting the colors of a dying and cold sun, while the first stars appear in the black. He is a small and insignificant pulse of heat, living in the lungs of a giant and sleeping deity, waiting for the next breath of the long night. The weight of the silence returns with the coming dark, pressing against the roof of the small and lonely house, as Elias closes his tired and weary eyes. Elias kneels in the deep and biting powder, feeling the wet snow soak through his heavy canvas trousers, as the forest watches his small movements. His numb fingers struggle with the cold steel of the snare, sensing the tension of the coiled and lethal wire, while the wind whispers of death. The metal is a cruel and biting tooth of silver, tasting the salt of his cracked and bleeding skin, as he sets the deadly mechanism. He places the trap near the base of a hollowed cedar, hiding the scent of man with the bitter and dark pine, while the shadows grow long. Every movement must be precise and perfectly executed, or the cold will claim his clumsy and stiff limbs before the setting of the sun. The wire feels like a thin and freezing nerve, vibrating with the potential of a quick and sudden snap, as the man holds his breath. He remembers the warmth of a woman's soft and gentle hand, but the memory is a distant and fading ghost, lost in the white void. The forest is a cathedral of ancient and indifferent stone, offering no prayer for the survival of the hungry and the small in this winter. He covers the trap with a layer of fine and dry snow, using a bird's feather to erase the traces of his heavy and tired boots. The hunger in his belly is a low and constant growl, echoing the sound of the ice shifting on the river as the light dies. He is a predator made of brittle and aching bone, hunting for a life to sustain his own failing and weary pulse in the dark. The trees stand like skeletal and silent sentinels of the frost, marking the boundary between the living and their eternal and cold sleep of Alaska. A sudden and heavy scent of musk fills the frozen air, carrying the warning of a great and ancient beast lurking in the thick timber. Elias freezes in the middle of the vast and white clearing, feeling the hair rise on his cold and damp neck as he listens. The grizzly is a mountain of dark and matted fur, moving with a silent and terrifying grace through the deep and heavy drifts of snow. Its breath is a thick and hot cloud of sulfur, contrasting with the purity of the crystalline and sharp air, while the man remains still. He grips the handle of his rusted and old knife, feeling the pulse of his heart in his dry and tight throat as death watches. The bear does not look at the small and shivering human, but its presence is a heavy and divine weight, crushing the hope of the day. It represents the raw and unblinking power of the wild, a god that demands respect and absolute and silent submission from all who walk here. Elias remains a statue of flesh and frozen cloth, waiting for the monster to pass into the shadows of the valley and leave him alone. The silence that follows the departure of the beast is heavy, pressing against his ribs like a physical and solid hand as he exhales. He realizes that his life is a fragile and flickering candle, easily extinguished by the whim of a creature that belongs to the ancient ice. The tracks left in the snow are deep and terrifying craters, showing the sheer mass of the predator that owns this cold and vast land. He turns back toward his cabin with a hurried and desperate pace, sensing the eyes of the forest following his every and cautious step. Inside the cabin, the cold has found a way through the cracks, biting at his heels and his raw and swollen hands as he sits by the flickering and low light of the lamp, observing the deep and angry fissures in his dry and yellowed and thick skin. The blood has dried into dark and crusty maps of pain, tracing the history of his labor and his long and bitter struggle for life. He applies a thick and greasy salve made of animal fat, feeling the sting of the medicine in his open and raw and red wounds. Every joint in his body feels like a rusted and old hinge, groaning with the effort of a simple and slow and calculated movement tonight. The weight of the winter is a physical and heavy burden, pressing down on his spine until he feels small and crushed and utterly broken. He stares at the flame of the candle with a hollow and wide gaze, wondering how much longer his flesh can endure the constant and freezing. The walls of the cabin are a thin and fragile shell of wood, separating his warmth from the immense and hungry and black void of Alaska. He touches the scar on his shoulder with a trembling and weak hand, remembering the world that existed before the silence and the white and snow. The pain is a companion that never leaves his side, a constant and loyal shadow that reminds him of his own finite and fragile and body. He wraps his hands in strips of old and tattered linen, securing the bandages with a knot that requires all of his remaining and dull. The darkness outside is a living and breathing entity of frost, waiting for the fire to die so it can claim the last of. He counts the remaining pieces of dried and salty venison, calculating the days of life left in the small and wooden and dusty box. Every bite is a ritual of necessity and grim survival, providing the fuel for another day of cold and hard and unrelenting and heavy. He chews the tough and leathery meat with a slow and deliberate focus, tasting the smoke and the salt and the bitter and wood. The water in the bucket has a thin and crystalline skin of ice, which he breaks with a heavy and metal and silver spoon. He drinks the freezing liquid in small and cautious sips, feeling the chill spread through his chest and his stomach and his very bones. The fire in the stove is a dying and orange ember, casting long and dancing shadows against the rough and peeling and dark bark. He knows that he must sleep to conserve his dwindling and precious heat, but the fear of the dark is a sharp and. The silence of the cabin is filled with the sound of his own breath, a rhythmic and fragile pulse in the middle of the. He lies down on the bed of furs and old blankets, feeling the cold seep up from the floor and the walls and the. The world of men is a dream that has no place in this reality, where only the strong and the cold and the... He closes his eyes and listens to the heart of the mountain, a slow and deep thrum that speaks of the coming end. Elias is a ghost in a landscape of white and indigo and blood, waiting for the dawn to bring another day of bitter and. Elias leans over the basin of freezing and gray water, breaking the thin crust of ice with his swollen and blue knuckles. He catches a glimpse of a stranger in the dark and distorted reflection, a man with hollowed eyes and a beard of white frost. The face in the water is a map of deep and jagged lines, telling the story of 1,000 cold and lonely and bitter nights. He touches the skin of his cheek with a rough and trembling hand, feeling the texture of leather and the bite of the Arctic air. The mirror of the water reveals the stripping of his former and arrogant self, leaving only the raw and primal and hungry core. He no longer recognizes the person who once walked the paved and warm streets of a city filled with noise and mindless and easy light. The silence of Alaska has eaten away the layers of his civilized and hollow mask, revealing the bone and the spirit and the animal. He splashes the liquid onto his face with a sudden and sharp gasp, feeling the needles of ice pierce his tired and weary and old eyes. Every drop of water feels like a heavy and cold weight, dragging his soul down into the dark and bottomless and frozen well of time. He stares at the flickering candle reflected in the basin, a tiny and fragile spark in a world of immense and crushing and absolute black. The cabin is filled with the scent of wet wool and wood and ancient dust, a smell that has become his only and constant and loyal friend. He dries his face with a piece of coarse and stained linen, sensing the fragility of his own pulse against the vast and indifferent void. The wind begins to speak in a high and mournful and terrifying tongue, clawing at the thick and heavy logs of the small cabin. Elias listens to the screams of the storm with a calm and hollow heart, understanding the grammar of the cold and the white and the dark. He speaks a single word aloud to the empty and shadowed room, just to hear the vibration of a human and living and desperate voice. The sound of his own name is a strange and alien and forgot thing, echoing against the walls before it is swallowed by the winter. He remembers the laughter of children in a sun-drenched and distant park, but the sound is now a ghost that haunts his heavy and tired mind. The loneliness is a physical and heavy cloak of lead, wrapping around his chest until he can no longer breathe the thin and freezing air. He paces the small and narrow length of the floor, counting each step as a victory against the madness and the silence and the growing dark. The shadows dance in the corners like specters of his past and his failures, waiting for the oil in the lamp to vanish and die. He knows that the mind is a fragile and brittle and delicate thing, prone to breaking under the pressure of their eternal and silent and white. He focuses on the physical reality of the rusted and old iron stove, touching the hot metal to ground his drifting and fading and weary soul. The mountain is a god that does not hear his small and quiet and desperate prayers, preferring the song of the ice and the ancient wind. He sits by the fire and watches the sparks rise like tiny and gold stars, disappearing into the black and hungry and cold throat of the chimney. In the flickering light, he sees the face of a woman with soft and golden hair, smiling at him from a world that no longer truly exists. He reaches out with a numb and scarred and heavy hand, but the vision dissolves into the smoke and the shadows and the bitter cold. The memory of her scent is a fleeting and painful and sharp sting, like a needle of ice driven into his very and hollow and aching heart. He tries to hold onto the image of her blue and gentle and warm eyes, but the darkness of Alaska is stronger than his fading and weak will. He recalls the weight of a silk tie around his neck and the sharp and clean smell of a new and expensive and dark wool suit. Those objects belong to a man who died long ago in the heat and the noise, leaving only this creature of bone and frost and heavy fur. The past is a heavy and useless anchor in this sea of white and shifting and deep snow, dragging him toward a shore of cold and silence. He chooses to bury the memories under the weight of his daily and brutal tasks, focusing only on the fire and the meat and the freezing. The cabin is a vessel sailing through a night of stars and indigo and absolute void. carrying the last remains of a human and broken and lonely. He traces the grain of the wooden table with a slow and rhythmic and mechanical finger, seeking a pattern in the chaos of the old and dark wood. Every scratch in the timber is a mark of time and labor, and the slow and steady erosion of his own and fragile and mortal life. He feels the presence of the ancestors who walked this land before him, ghosts of the trail who left only their silence and their bitter and cold. He organizes his few and rusted and simple tools on the wooden bench, seeking a sense of order in a world of wild and chaotic. The axe and the knife and the saw are his only and true and faithful companions, silent partners in the dance of life and death and cold. He sharpens the blade of the knife with a steady and rhythmic and slow stone, listening to the metallic and sharp and high and thin whistle. Their edge is a line of silver and lethal and cold light, capable of cutting through the hide and the muscle and the bone of the wild. He measures the distance between the door and the hearth with a tired and calculating and heavy eye, planning every move for the coming and long. Every inch of space is a territory that must be defended against the encroaching and hungry and dark and freezing winter that waits outside his door. He feels the structure of the cabin groan under the weight of the new and heavy and wet snow, a pressure that never eases or stops. He is the center of a small and fading and fragile circle of light, surrounded by a universe of black and white and indifferent and cold stars. The ritual of the sharpening brings a sense of peace to his troubled and weary and dark mind, a focus that shuts out the screaming and wind. He checks the seals on the windows with a strip of heavy and gray and old felt, blocking the entry of the lethal and thin and air. His life is a series of small and repetitive and necessary and brutal movements, designed to keep the heart beating against the heavy and cold silence. He lies down on the floor near the warmth of the fading and orange and low fire, waiting for the sleep that feels like a temporary and soft. The sky collapses into a swirling and violent and blinding white as the great blizzard strikes the lonely and small cabin. Elias hears the timber scream under the sudden and heavy and immense pressure of the wind that travels from the frozen Arctic. He struggles to bolt the heavy and thick and weathered wooden door, feeling the icy breath of the storm against his raw skin. The world outside has vanished into a chaotic and screaming and absolute void, where even the ancient trees are lost to the sight. He feels the cabin shudder like a dying and fragile and wooden beast, caught in the iron grip of a cold and angry god. Every crack in the wall becomes a high and thin and haunting whistle, bringing the lethal dust of the snow into his small room. He piles his remaining blankets against the base of the shivering and cold door, desperate to keep the warmth from escaping into the dark. The fire in the hearth flickers and gasps for a clean and steady breath, as the air is sucked out by the hungry and wild. He knows that nature is no longer watching but actively and cruelly and silently hunting for the last spark of his fading and weary life. His vision is blurred by the smoke and the fine and stinging and white powder, which fills the cramped and dim and terrifying space. He grips the edge of the heavy and scarred and old wooden table, sensing the vibration of the earth through his tired and aching feet. The darkness is a physical and heavy and suffocating and cold presence, demanding the surrender of his soul to their eternal and quiet winter. The kerosene lamp flickers and dies with a final and small and oily gasp, leaving Elias in a world of thick and black. He reaches for the box of matches with a frantic and trembling and numb hand, feeling the hollow void where his hope used to lie. His fingers graze the cold and dusty and empty bottom of the tin, realizing the flint has fallen into the dark and deep cracks. He drops to his knees on the freezing and hard and splintered floor, searching for the means to create a single and tiny and life-saving. The cold begins to slow the rhythm of his heavy and tired and desperate heart, turning his blood into a sluggish and frozen and thick river. He feels the phantom touch of the frost crawling up his stiff and aching legs, claiming the territory of his body for the silent and white. His breath comes in short and shallow and jagged and painful bursts, as he crawls through the shadows of his own and lonely and small. The memory of fire is a cruel and distant and mocking and bright dream, lost in the reality of the ice and the dark and He finds the small metal striker wedged beneath a heavy and rusted and old iron leg of the stove that has gone cold, and his knuckles bleed as he strikes the stone with a sudden and fierce and desperate intensity, praying for a spark to catch the dry and. The scent of sulfur is a brief and sharp and chemical and hopeful sign in the middle of their immense and crushing and absolute and. He watches the first tiny orange glow feed on a scrap of frayed and old and dry linen, breathing life into the dark and. As the small flame grows, he sees the walls of the cabin begin to melt, turning into a forest of green and gold and. He hears the sound of a rushing and warm and sun-drenched and clear river, flowing through the middle of his cold and lonely and gray. The faces of his mother and his father appear in the dancing and flickering and bright shadows, beckoning him to come home to the. He reaches out to touch the warmth of their spectral and soft and loving and glowing skin, forgetting the bite of their Alaskan and. The heat is an illusion created by the final and desperate and dying and flickering energy of a brain that is shutting down in the. He feels a strange and terrifying and seductive and soft sense of peace, as the desire to sleep becomes a heavy and sweet and. The wind outside is no longer a scream but a low and rhythmic and soothing and gentle lullaby, sung by the gods of the. He realizes that to close his eyes is to accept the invitation of the cosmic and long and silent and deep and eternal and. He shakes his head with a sudden and violent and painful and sharp motion, breaking the spell of the white and cold and deadly. The reality of the freezing room returns with a brutal and sharp and honest and heavy blow, crushing the visions of the past and. He feeds the last of his furniture into the small and hungry and red and orange fire, watching his chair turn into smoke and. The sacrifice of his only comfort is the price of a few more hours of bitter and hard and lonely and desperate and. He slices his palm on a jagged and sharp and protruding and rusted nail, while trying to break the heavy and thick and. The blood is a brilliant and shocking and vivid and deep shade of crimson, falling onto the purity of the new and white. He stares at the contrast between his own biological and warm and pulsing and red life, and the monotony of the gray and. The pain is a sharp and necessary and grounding and loud and honest scream, reminding him that he is still a man of. He uses the injury to fuel his fading and weary and dark and heavy will, refusing to be erased by the silence and the. Every drop of blood is a testament to his refusal to be forgot or swallowed by their immense and indifferent and cold and. The storm begins to lose its initial and violent and terrifying and sudden and sharp edge, as the dawn light touches the high and. He stands by the window with a bandaged and throbbing and heavy and warm hand, watching the world emerge from the long and. The landscape is a tomb of white and indigo and silver and cold and silent and deep and vast and ancient and. He has survived the breaking point, but at a cost that is etched into his very and hollow and aching and tired and. The silence returns with a new and different and heavy and profound and solemn and quiet and respectful and strange and high and. Elias breathes the freezing air and feels the weight of his own existence, a small and stubborn and red pulse in the. The blizzard departs with a final and low and mournful and hollow and ghostly whistle, leaving a world of pure and white. Elias pushes against the heavy and frozen and solid and unyielding and thick wooden door, feeling the resistance of the new and deep. The landscape has been redesigned by the hand of an invisible and cold and divine and arrogant and silent and ancient and God. He steps out into the blinding and sharp and crystalline and silver and brilliant and cold light of the first and calm. Every tree is a statue of intricate and delicate and heavy and white and fragile and frozen and silent and weeping and glass. The silence is no longer an enemy but a respectful and deep and solemn and vast and quiet and peaceful and heavy and. He breathes the air of the mountain and feels their expansion of his cold and tired and weary and hollow and aching. The horizon is a line of indigo and violet and gold and fire and light, marking the boundary of his own and small. He finds a small bird frozen mid-flight against the trunk of a pine, a tiny and perfect and still and cold and. Its wings are locked in a final and desperate and elegant and silent and beautiful and tragic, and frozen and courageous and. He touches the feathers with a gentle and scarred and numb and trembling and soft, and respectful and heavy and warm and. The creature is a mirror of his own fragility and his own struggle and his own and brief, and flickering and mortal. He reaches into the pocket of his heavy and worn and stained, and thick and frozen and dark and old and wool. He pulls out a small and tarnished and silver and sentimental and heavy and cold, and engraved and oval and antique and locket. Inside is the face of the woman who once occupied his heart, and his mind and his soul and his dreams and. He looks at the image with a calm and distant and serene and hollow and quiet, and accepting and peaceful and dry. The memory no longer brings the sharp and biting and agonizing and deep and heavy and cruel and dark and bitter and. He digs a small hole in the fresh and powdery and white and cold and deep and silent and ancient and heavy. He places the metal object into the earth and covers it with the frozen and crystalline and pure and white and soft. The act is a final stripping of his ego and his history and his pain and his desire and his and human. He stands up and feels the weight of the world lift from his broad and tired and weary and aching and heavy. He is no longer the man who arrived with a suitcase and a name and a past and a fear and a. The Alaskan wilderness has claimed the parts of him that were hollow and false and arrogant and weak and social and. He is now a part of the rhythm of the snow and the wind and the ice and the dark and. He sits on a large and flat and black and ancient and frozen and heavy and silent and cold and weathered and. He closes his eyes and listens to the deep and slow and rhythmic and powerful and ancient and tectonic and heavy and. The earth breathes beneath his feet with a pulse that is older than the sun and the stars and the moon and. He feels the vibration of the cosmic slumber in his own and hollow and weary and aching and human and small and. The distance between the stars and his own heart is a bridge of light and silence and time and space and cold. He realizes that his existence is a brief and beautiful and tragic and small and flickering and divine and mortal and quiet. The fear of being forgot is replaced by the joy of being a part of the immense and indifferent and vast and. He watches the shadows move across the valley like the hands of a clock that measures their eternity of the white and. The cabin behind him is a small and insignificant and fragile and wooden and dark and lonely and brave and warm and. He does not need the walls to define his soul or his strength or his purpose or his life or his. The sky is his ceiling, and the snow is his bed, and the wind is his voice, and the cold is. He is the observer of the end of the world, and the beginning of a new and silent and pure and. The sun begins to set behind the jagged and sharp and dark and ancient and heavy and purple, and high and distant. The colors of the sky are a symphony of blood and fire, and gold and indigo and violet and black and deep and. Elias remains still, as the temperature begins to drop into the lethal and silent and deep and dark and cold and vast. He accepts the coming of the night as a friend and a brother and a teacher and a guide and a and. His breath is a slow and steady and rhythmic and white and ghostly and fading and peaceful and quiet and final and. He looks at the horizon one last time with eyes that are clear and bright and hollow and ancient and serene and. The transience of his biological life is a gift that he embraces with a calm and open and heavy and warm. The metaphor of the man in the ice is a story of a spark that returned to the fire of the. The silence returns to the cabin and the ridge and the valley and the forest and the mountain and the sky and. There is no longer a battle or a struggle or a fear or a hunger or a pain or a dark and. Only the rhythmic pulse of the cosmic slumber remains in the middle of the white and the black and the gold. Elias is the silence, and the silence is Elias in the heart of their eternal and vast and cold and beautiful.